Okay, so now we're on to Chapter 7. This is the last unit in this module. So be ready for a test after this. We went through kind of energy and enzymes, and then we went through cellular respiration, and now we're going to talk about photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is the conversion of light energy to chemical energy. And then they store that chemical energies in sugars and made from carbon dioxide and water. So they take inorganic molecules and make something organic. So algae farms, we can use those to produce oils for biodiesel or carbohydrates to generate ethanol for fuel. And they're working on that, and it's slowly getting better. Right now, oil is much cheaper, and as long as oil is cheaper, then they're not really going to move too far to the biofuels. Once we use up so much oil, it becomes really expensive, and biofuels will become less expensive, and then everybody will be grateful for biofuels. So, big ideas, kind of an overview. Photosynthesis, the light reaction, the Calvin cycle, and kind of a little bit extra of photosynthesis at the end, which I'll move through. So here's your algae. Each one of these can take carbon dioxide and water and turn it into sugar and air, oxygen. So here's an overview. Okay, autotrophs. Auto means self. So automobile, self-mobile, right? Autotrophs. They make their own food. And so they can sustain themselves. They don't need anything else around. And they don't usually consume organic molecules. But if you plant anything, sometimes you need nitrates and phosphates, right? Those are inorganic molecules. And they only need a slight amount. When we pour tons of them down, it runs off downstream, causes all sorts of problems and different things like that when we put too many nitrates and phosphates in our water supply. Photoautotrophs. So photo, like picture, but in this case, photon, auto, self, troph means eating. Okay, think of it as pig trough, right? So photon, self-eating, that's photoautotroph. It uses the energy of light to produce organic molecules. Okay, chemoautotrophs, chemicals, auto, self, troughs, eating, are prokaryotes that use inorganic chemicals as their energy source. Heterotrophs. Okay? Hetero. Homo, same. Hetero, different. Okay? So different eating. So those are consumers. They have to eat something else. We have to eat something different in order to survive, in order to gain our energy. We are heterotrophs, which is the definition of an animal. We are animals. Now, we like to think we're really smart animals. That can be debated, I think, and debated very well. But I think there is maybe something to that with our technology. Our technology has allowed us to do things that no other animals have been able to do. However, we must not make the mistake of assuming we are better than bacteria or better than a squirrel running down the street or whatever. We must not make the assumption that we are better than they are simply because we have technology. We have to eat them. We have to eat that squirrel or eat that cow or whatever. That's to stay alive. Yeah, that's true. But it doesn't mean we are better. When you look in the Mediterranean Sea, the largest predators on dolphins are great white sharks. And great white sharks are, supposed to be this big dumb animal, and dolphins are supposed to be this really smart animal. But if we're talking about better, then great white sharks would be better than dolphins just because they eat them, and that's not correct. And that's just a very, very poor way of thinking. Photosynthesis. Photo, remember? Photon? Synthesis, creation, synthesizing, bringing together, creating something new. Okay? Creation does not mean to make something out of nothing. It means to simply rearrange what is already there into something new. Photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast. It takes carbon dioxide, water, and turns them into glucose and releases oxygen. So here's some trees and plants and single-celled and some algae. Okay, this right here, this is kelp. It is not a plant. These are plants, and they're vascular plants. They have vascular tissue. Think of that kind of blood. This kelp is an algae, and my pen just broke. It's just a really, really, really big algae, like 100 feet high type of algae. It doesn't have any root systems. It has a holdfast. A lot of people think that algae is plants. It's just algae. Pretty cool. Cool stuff. Chloroplast, the major site of photosynthesis in green plants. Notice that green right there? In chloroplast, there's chlorophyll. And so that absorbs the photon and is also responsible for the green color of plants. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit. And it converts the solar energy to chemical energy. Chloroplasts are concentrated in the cells of the mesophyllae, right? The green tissue. Think of it kind of just under the skin, I guess, of the leaf. And the stomata, okay? Stomata, they're the little holes in the leaf that let carbon dioxide in and oxygen out. And then there's vein. Remember we talked about vascular tissue. There's vascular tissue in the leaves that deliver the water absorbed by the roots. Okay? So, here's a little hole, the stomata. Right? This right here is the tissue, or the mesophilia. Right? Here's the vein that delivers the water. This is all in a leaf. Okay? And inside, when you look at the leaf, you get the chloroplast. Whole thing is a chloroplast. Now notice, check this out, and I'm going to do this in a different color so it makes a little bit more sense. Stroma is that fluid in here. Okay? Stoma are the holes in the leaf to allow for gas exchange. Do not confuse those two. It's a very popular test question to try to confuse you. And so thylakoids are each one of these individual coins, where the granium is the whole thing. Okay? And there's space in the thylakoids. So that is your chloroplast. That is what does the magic. That's what keeps us alive. Without plants, we would all die. So the chloroplast has an envelope, membrane. Remember, the inner compartment is thick fluid called stroma. The stoma are the holes in the leaf for gas exchange. And then they have kind of those coins in there that are interconnected, and those are called thylakoids. There you go again, a little close-up to help you see it a little better. And so we knew way back in the 1800s that plants produced oxygen, but we didn't know whether this oxygen came from the carbon dioxide or from the water. So for many years it was assumed that oxygen was extracted from carbon dioxide and taken into the plant. However, using an isotope of oxygen, oxygen-18, confirmed that the oxygen produced by photosynthesis comes from water. Okay? The oxygen we breathe in our air comes from fresh water that plants use. So, took those isotopes, they traced it. In one, you have your carbon dioxide, right? And they followed that around, and boom, it went to the sugar, okay? And the water, but it did not go to the oxygen. Experiment 2, they put it in the water, and that went to the oxygen. Okay, so here's your reactants. Carbon dioxide, the carbon goes to the glucose. The oxygen and carbon dioxide goes to the glucose. The hydrogen in the glucose comes from the water. The hydrogen that is the water byproduct comes from the hydrogen. The hydrogen comes from the water, and the oxygen comes from the carbon dioxide, and the oxygen that is produced by the plant comes from the water. So photosynthesis, light energy is captured by the chlorophyll and boosts the energy of electrons. So remember, energy flows. So energy will be kind of at its slowest step, but then the light energy excites those electrons and increases kind of that step of energy. So light energy is converted to that chemical energy, and then it's stored in the bonds of the sugar. Okay, so there's your equation again. Your sugar and your oxygen makes carbon dioxide and water. And photosynthesis is the reverse of that. So there's two metabolic stages. The light reaction, which is in the thylakoids. Remember those the thylakoids. So water split, because remember, hydrogen has to go one place and oxygen to another place. And that creates a source of electrons. ATP is generated from ADP and the phosphate group. And then our light energy is absorbed by the chlorophyll to drive the transfer of electrons. And then we have NADPH, that P is for phosphate, H is for hydrogen. It's produced by the light reaction. Second stage is the Calvin cycle, right, or Krebs cycle, which occurs in the stroma of the chloroplasts. And so there's a cycling series of reactions that assemble sugar molecules using the carbon dioxide, and then the energy from the light reactions. During the Calvin cycle, carbon dioxide is made into organic compounds, and this is a process called carbon fixation, and that's what it means to fix carbon. Take carbon from a gas and make it into an organic compound. That is carbon fixation. And in fact, when they say we are cornbread, that is because 70% of the carbon in our body was fixed by corn. Now, we don't always just eat straight corn, but we feed corn to other animals and then eat those other animals. And so the carbon fixed in our body comes from corn, 70% of it. So after the carbon's fixed, enzymes of the cycle make sugars by further reducing the carbon compounds. And that Calvin cycle is often called the dark reaction or light independent because it can happen in the middle of the night. It doesn't need any light to happen. The first one, the light cycle, needs light, but this one doesn't happen, and we'll see some adaptations that take advantage of that. So here's your graphic. Light creates the light reactions of thylakoid. Water gets split. Hydrogen containing those electrons is used to alter chemicals, produce ATP. Oxygen is released as a byproduct. This is where we get the oxygen that we breathe. Carbon dioxide comes in, takes some of those hydrogens and produces, with the carbon, produces glucose. That happens in the stroma, and sugar is released. So, light reactions. So sunlight has tons of energy, right? And it gives off tons of energy, and we only use maybe 1% of that energy. We only capture 1% of that. There's so much energy that's just lost. And so what we see, the visible light, the red on this, the blue on this, and the black and all that white or whatever, that's the visible spectrum that we can see. And that's only a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay, and so when we talk about the electromagnetic spectrum, we're talking about energy, how it travels in waves. And so it can travel in kind of slow rolling waves. It can travel in very fast waves. And the wavelength will depend on the color that gets refracted. And wavelength is the difference between the crests. Okay? So, light is a discrete package of energy called photons. So a photon is a fixed quantity of light energy. It's a certain amount of light energy. And the shorter the wavelength, remember, we're talking about wavelength here, talking about the difference between two crests, the greater the energy. So if we have two crests close together here versus crest here, the crest here, this second one has less energy than this first one. Okay, here's your graphic. What we see is a small part. On the far left we have gamma rays, right? And I think that's what made the Hulk, supposedly, right? The gamma rays. And then X-rays, right? These are lots of energy in there. And that's why the energy can break DNA bonds. That's why we wear those lead things when we get X-rays, right? Because it can break DNA and cause all sorts of problems. UV, the ultraviolet, there's lots of energy in there. And then on the right side, we get radio waves, not too much energy. Microwaves used to excite the hydrogen electrons from water in your food. And that's why if you have like some dry piece of bread and you stick it in the microwave with a wet towel, that piece of bread becomes moist or whatever. And then our infrared, right? That's low energy light wave. So what we see is a very small part, 380 to 750, not a whole lot. And we're talking nanometers. That's the actual length. So pigments absorb light and are built into the thylakoid membrane. So what light pigments are thylakoids? If thylakoids are responsible for green, that means they reflect green. So when we're talking about here, right about, what is that, 520, 530, that is the wavelength that gets reflected from the thylakoid membranes, not what gets absorbed. Okay. So plant pigments absorb some wavelengths and reflect others. So plants are green because that is what they reflect, not because of what they absorb. So there's your graphic, and so you got your rainbow being absorbed and green being reflected. So if I ask you why some things appear red, because that's the wavelength that gets reflected. Chloroplasts contain several different pigments which absorb light of different wavelengths. Okay, Chlorophyll A is blue to violet and red light. Chlorophyll B, blue and orange, reflects yellow, green. Carotenoids, kind of the carrots, right? They're going to reflect the orange. And so this allows more energy to start photosynthesis. So when they capture the photons, that increases the potential energy of those electrons. And those electrons are in an unstable state, and of course these electrons want to drop back down to their stable state, and as they do, they release their excess energy as heat. So plants can give off heat. Pretty cool. So there's graphic photon of light. Boom, hits that electron gets into an excited state. Heat is given off photon fluorescence, and then it's going to fall back down as it falls back down to its ground state, so the original state. So thylakoid membranes, chlorophyll, they absorb those photons, transfer the energy to other pigments. In the thylakoid membrane, chlorophyll molecules are organized along with other pigments, proteins, into photosynthesis. So it takes some organization to make this work. And there's two types of photosystems, photosystem 1, photosystem 2. And they're called that because of the wavelength that they absorb. So photosystem 1 absorbs 680, or photosystem 2 absorbs 680, photosystem 1 700. Okay? So photosystem 2 happens first. Seems a little backwards, I understand that, but just remember photosystem 2 happens first, and then photosystem 1, and we'll get a graphic here to help you understand that here in a second. So in these are light reactions, remember, there's light and dark reactions, and dark reactions are citric acid cycle and don't necessarily need light to occur. But the first one, the light reactions, has to have light to excite those electrons. And so the light energy is transformed into chemical energy, and to do this, electrons have to be removed from the water and pass from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1, and then accepted. There needs to be an electron acceptor of NADP, and then that gets reduced, and so between those two photosystems, the electrons move down an electron transport chain and give off energy. So here's our photon, right? That light comes in, and that's energy, and it excites this electron up into an excited state. So up here, the difference between this and here at the bottom, this is all potential energy. Okay, and so that starts to move, and as it moves, it creates ATP, and then another photon, so sunlight again, comes in and moves it up to an excited state, right? And then it gets collected by this molecule here. So that's photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. So the chemoosmosis is the mechanism that's involved in oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria, and it also generates ATP in chloroplast, and that's it's the same thing. So that's really, really interesting, kind of cool. And the ATP is generated because the electron transport chain produces a concentration gradient of hydrogen ions across the membrane. Okay, just like in the mitochondria. The photophosphorylation, using the initial energy from light, and then you get the electron transport chain. It pumps those hydrogens into the thylakoid space, and then the concentration gradient. Okay, it's all about those concentration gradients. Every time drives the hydrogen back through ATP synthase, producing ATP. Okay, here's your graphic. Thylakoid space, thylakoid membrane, and stroma, right? Light excite those electrons, and then you get this high concentration, and that high concentration moves through, and then through ATP synthase. And if you remember, This is reversed of cellular respiration that we went over in the last chapter. It was the other way, and that's really cool to see those inverse relationships. So when we talk about photophosphorylation, when we talk about oxidative phosphorylation, what are kind of the differences and similarity? And so our mitochondria uses oxidative phosphorylation to transfer that chemical energy. And chloroplasts use photophosphorylation to transfer the energy. So Calvin cycle, okay? So CO2, ATP, NADP, and then you get your G3, which is a 3-chain carbon, right? And so remember, carbon fixation occurs in the Calvin cycle, and we get the reduction and release of a 3-chain glucose-type molecule, which can then be built into glucose. And the regeneration of the starting molecule, ribulose biphosphate, Rubert. Okay. So input 3 of the CO2s. All right, and then we get a 3-chain carbon and take some energy and to move those electrons. Electrons are moved. Then we take that 3-chain carbon that can then be used for glucose, but it also goes back into the cycle, takes a little bit more energy. We're adding our phosphates to it, and so we get our Rubisco, right? So plants use the CO2 from the air, and the carbon fixation occurs when the enzyme Rubisco adds CO2 to Rubert, right? So think of it this way. If I take some soil, okay, we'll call this soil, and I dry it out and it weighs 100 grams, okay? Then I add a seed that weighs 1 gram, okay? Then I put it in a pot. Here's our pot. Add water and all those kinds of things, and out grows a big plant. I then pull out that plant, and the soil, and the plant weighs 200 grams. How much is the soil going to weigh? And think about that for a second. What's going to happen is this soil is going to weigh the same, essentially the same, about 100 grams. It'd be 99.9 or something like that because of some trace elements. So where did we get these 200 grams from? Where did that come from? And the answer is directly from the air. So, in hot, dry weather, okay, we have what's called C3 plants, and they close their stomata to reduce water loss. But that prevents oxygen from leaving and CO2 from coming in, right? So you don't want to keep them closed or the plant's going to die. But as O2 builds up in the leaf, Rubisco adds O2 instead of CO2, and a 2-carbon product of this reaction is then broken down in the cell. Okay, so this is called photorespiration because it occurs in the light, consumes O2, and releases CO2. But unlike cellular respiration, it uses ATP instead of producing it. But this is what the plants use to kind of stay alive. C4 plants have evolved a means of carbon fixation that saves water, right? Optimizes the Calvin cycle. C4 plants are named because they first fix CO2 into a 4-carbon compound. And when the weather is hot and dry, C4 plants keep their stomata mostly closed, and they conserve water that way. Another adaptation to hot and dry environments are the cam plants, pineapples and cacti. Cam plants conserve water by opening their stomata and emitting CO2 only at night. And CO2 is fixed in 4-carbon, which then banks the CO2 at night and releases it to the Calvin cycle during the day. Okay. So here's your sugar cane, and carbon dioxide in a 4-carbon compound, and then it waits till it releases that to the Calvin cycle, and at night it doesn't bundle up, it just takes it straight there. So for the CAM plant. So C4 plant kind of has that bundle sheath cell, and the CAM plant brings in CO2 only at night. So, kind of the extension. Hope you're still with me. And so most of the living world depends on photosynthesis, and that should be clear by now. And so half of the carbohydrates made by photosynthesis are consumed as fuel for cellular respiration in the mitochondria, right? So photosynthesis makes carbs, but then the mitochondria, the plant cell, uses it up to do create energy for the cell. And so it also serves as the starting point for organic molecules like proteins, lipids, and cellulose, which is the most abundant sugar we have on the planet and none of us can eat it. So sometimes plants get excess food, okay, and they store that, and we end up eating it. So roots, tubers, seeds, fruits, right, carrots, potatoes, things like that. So here's light reaction, photosystem 2, electron transport chain, photosynthesis system 1, and then moving to the Calvin cycle. That sugar is used for cellular respiration, cellulose, starch, and lots of other organic compounds. So let's talk about the greenhouse effect. Okay, and this is very important. The greenhouse effect. You should know what it is, and it operates on a global scale, and it has to do with wavelengths. Okay, we talked about wavelengths. So solar radiation, right, is that visible light, and it penetrates Earth's atmosphere and warms the planet's surface. And then heat radiating from the warm planet is absorbed by gases in the atmosphere, which then reflects some of the heat back. Okay, without the greenhouse effect, the Earth would be ice. Right? Much of life as we know it could not exist. But then there's the other part. With too much, we can also not have life. So here's basic. Let me find a good color. Let's try green. So light comes through in a certain wavelength. Okay? And then when it hits the flowers, hits the ground, it gets reflected back. But once that photon hits, it's a different wavelength. Okay? And so when that different wavelength has a higher probability of hitting that glass and getting reflected back down, creating heat. Where when it was this longer wavelength coming in, there was less of a probability of it hitting the glass and being reflected back out. And so that's the basic greenhouse effect. A lot of people think, well, why, if carbon dioxide in the air is causing so much problem, why doesn't it prevent light waves in the first place? Well, they're coming in at different wavelengths. Okay? So here you see your big graphic, your sunlight comes in at a certain wavelength, hits the Earth, and bounces back at a different wavelength, and that different wavelength has a higher probability of hitting those CO2 molecules. So the gases that absorb heat, water vapor does, carbon dioxide does, and methane does. Okay? So water vapor does absorb some heat, but it doesn't absorb nearly as much as carbon dioxide. Methane absorbs some as well, but it doesn't absorb nearly as much as carbon dioxide. This is our big This is our big issue, and the reason why it's an issue is because there's a carbon cycle. There's short-term cycle and long-term cycle. So think of a carbon, okay, and it comes through and gets absorbed by a plant. And something comes and eats this plant, and so let me make a Pac-Man. Give him teeth. He eats this plant, okay? So the carbon moves through there, and then it gets breathed out into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So, and then it can be reused back into the plant. That is a short-term cycle. Now there's long-term cycles for carbon. So carbon, it can be absorbed into rock, into calcium carbonate, right? It can be turned into fossil fuels. Okay. And these are all long-term cycles where it could be, 2 million years. Same with fossil fuels, so millions of years. Where in the short-term cycle, the average, I believe, is about 7 years. So we have a short-term cycle and a long-term cycle. Okay, what happens when we take, take something from a long-term cycle and add it to a short-term cycle, and we get this overload. Now this happens naturally, right, from your limestone or whatever. It naturally moves into the short-term cycle, but little by little, it happens over hundreds of thousands of years. It naturally moves, but we're taking it and moving it in, 50 years. And less. So we're taking a process that normally takes hundreds of thousands of years and doing it in under 50 years. So what that means is plants are not able to adapt, and simply adding more plants isn't going to solve the problem. Because of generation spans and all sorts of different things, and you can email me or contact me and we can get specifics if you want. So just adding more plants isn't going to solve it. And animals don't have time to evolve to deal with the increased temperature. And so we have the problems with this greenhouse gases, and when we overload one of the systems, if we think of ecosystems as balls, pushed together, and in one of these balls we have a marble. It's a marble. When we think about trying to push that marble up, okay, it takes energy to do that. And when it stops, the marble's of course going to always fall back down. But when we do push enough energy, that marble moves to an entire new ecosystem. So ecosystem 1 and ecosystem 2. Okay? And so that may or may not be a problem. Each person has to decide for themselves whether that's good or bad to completely alter the ecosystem. Nature will naturally find a balance, but we can push the balance, the ecosystem, and completely destroy it. A good example is when I was in Utah. Earlier settlers there took and cut down trees to the point where the trees right there by Provo and that only scrub oak and things grow there now instead of the pine trees that used to grow there. It's a completely different ecosystem. Sure, you go back into the valleys and there's pine trees and things like that again, but they completely altered the ecosystem, and it never came back the way it did. It found a different balance. So there's a good example of that happening. So when we increase concentrations of greenhouse gases, it's been linked to global climate change, sometimes called global warming. Global warming was originally called that by the media, despite scientists trying to get it called climate change. And then, what was it, 1997? I'll have to check my notes. A Republican activist asked that we call it global climate change because global warming was too scary. It wasn't politically correct, and scientists were okay with that because why it's referred to as global warming, it's not necessarily a warming everywhere. It's a massive, it's a change in climate, and a drastic change in climate over a short period of time. The Earth has all sorts of climate. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down, and sometimes fast, sometimes slow, right? And so when you look over millions and millions of years, temperatures go up and down, CO2 goes up and down. It has this natural fluctuation. But the problem is if this is the natural fluctuation, right? So point here to here is, let's call it 800,000 years, right? What we're doing to the atmosphere is increasing the rate. We're changing the rate. So now we're going for the same temperature, so this will be delta T, the change in temperature, and this will be delta Y, the change in years. So we'll get the same temperature change, but in a very short amount of time, in 100 years. So it's not that the Earth hasn't increased or decreased before. We've already gone over 400 carbon parts per million, which, and we're getting close to 500. So 500 parts per million, the climate is going to be different. So it's not that the climate hasn't changed before. We're affecting the rate at which the climate is changing, and we're increasing the rate so quickly that animals and nature doesn't have a chance to adapt. So since 1850s, right, the Industrial Revolution, excuse me, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 has increased by about 40%. And it's mostly due to the combustion of fossil fuels, coal, oil, gasoline, things like that. Does this mean we shouldn't use fossil fuels? I'm not saying that. I'm not going to claim that at all. You have to decide that for yourself. What I'm telling you is what the science can show us. You are going to have to put your own morality on this. I have mine, but it's a moral issue, and I'm not qualified to teach moral issues. You have to decide if the rate that we're changing, the way we're permanently altering the ecosystem, the way animals are going extinct at a massive rate, if that's good or not. You have to decide that. I can't decide that for you. You have to prioritize what's more important, personal freedom or animals going extinct, because it's not necessarily one or the other. Be wary of false dichotomies. But science is very clear. This is happening. Climate change is happening. We are affecting the environment. But once again, you have to decide if that's moral or not. So, predicted consequences, melting of polar ice. So in some places it's melting massively, some places it's creating ice. And you'll hear some people say, well, we're gaining ice in certain parts and losing it in other parts. But what happens, I mean, this is simple, when the sun hits the water, it's going to warm up. And then you get warmer water is less dense, okay? And so you get the warmer water dropping down, denser, colder water coming back up. And when denser, colder water hits the top, you get the formation of ice. And so you get these cycles, this water turbidity that isn't normally there. So in some places, ice is growing, and in other places it's melting. But it's in the places where it's melting is mostly land ice. And that's a big deal, because sea ice is not too big. So I think recently someone said, a politician said, okay, well, if I have water here and I have ice cubes in it, when the ice cubes melt, the water doesn't overflow. And so therefore, these melting water isn't a problem. But what he didn't realize is what he didn't distinguish is the difference between land ice and sea ice. So you have land ice, right there you have sea ice, and then in addition to that, you have lots of land ice that is now going to melt, and of course it's going to overflow when you add all of that together. So you get your rising sea levels, you have your melting of polar ice caps, making distance for polar bears to swim longer, so polar bears drown, and different things like that. You get extreme weather patterns. So if normally we get one Category 5 hurricane per year, I mean, obviously you look at an average over 30 plus years, all of a sudden we're going to get 2 to 3 Category 5s. So one, or we'll get 2 to 3. Okay? So more extreme weather patterns. So instead of just being Category 4, they're now Category 5. Droughts in some areas and floods in others. Increased extinction rates, which we see we are in the middle of a mass extinction. It's 1,000 times faster. Animals are going extinct at 1,000 times faster rate than historically they have. You get spread of tropical diseases. This is affecting us in Texas right now. Dengue fever is migrating north. Places in Florida and now in eastern Texas are getting affected by this. Dengue fever never used to be in the United States, and it's a nasty fever. You get it once, you get this really bad fever, but you get cured from it. You can come back from it. But if you get it again, it kills you through internal bleeding. It ruptures your organs. It ruptures your blood vessels. It is a nasty, nasty fever. And because things are warming, animals are moving north, and so are diseases. So, widespread deforestation has aggravated. Okay? Because remember, the plants will absorb the CO2. Okay? We also get CO2 into the ocean, which causes acidification. So deforestation is a CO2 sink, but more importantly, wetlands are a CO2 sink. The wetlands just south of Siberia, that is a huge wetland, and it is a massive CO2 sink because there's more surface area to collect CO2 than there is for trees. And of course they're moving through that and pulling it out, because you can get peat moss and use that for energy or fuel, and it's flat. You can build houses fairly easily, and so we're taking away our CO2 sinks, and we're adding to the greenhouse gases. So it may be, it's a key word, reduced by limiting deforestation. That will limit it. It will reduce it. Use science to show you how much. Reducing fossil fuel consumption and growing biofuel crops that remove CO2. Okay, so there are things we can do. Each of us have to decide whether we want to do them or not. What is more important? What is more important to us? Having non-regulation or increasing global warming? So that's for you guys to decide. You can come ask me my opinion if you want. But usually most people don't, because my opinion is not that important. Solar radiation converts O2 high in the atmosphere to ozone, which shields organisms from damaging UV radiation. Remember, wavelength, O3 blocks that out. Some chemicals have blocked that. This is why we no longer have some spray cans, right, that have the CFCs. And that's why we had that hole in the ozone and things like that. So this is should finish the module 2 and answer the questions, and we can move on to module 3.